Welcome back to the Cheating Tales Lab. First of all, a huge thank you for helping us reach 5,000 subscribers. Thank you all for your amazing support. To celebrate, we're launching our second channel, Infidelity Tales Lab, where you'll get one-day early access to all our stories plus exclusive, original cheating wife stories you won't find anywhere else. You can subscribe now by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment, or simply search for Infidelity Tales Lab on YouTube. Don't miss out. Subscribe and listen to exclusive stories. You won't regret subscribing. Now let's begin the story. Blake Kerr's steady hands, which had just performed a complex 16-hour heart surgery, gripped his car keys as he pulled into his driveway. The respected cardiothoracic surgeon had left Memorial Hospital early, his mind focused on completing the mounting paperwork from his latest procedures. The evening shadows stretched across his upscale home as he entered silently, his surgeon's instinct for quiet movement serving him well. As he approached his study, Patricia's voice drifted down from their bedroom, her tone carrying an unfamiliar note of calculation. "Mom, I've got it all planned out." Patricia's words sliced through the quiet house. Blake froze, his hand hovering over the study door handle. Something in her voice, a smug satisfaction, made him pause. "Once he's done paying for the kid's college, I'm filing for divorce," Patricia continued, each word driving an icy spike into Blake's chest. "Then I'll accuse him of domestic crime and live with Casey and the kids from his money." Blake's world tilted on its axis. Casey Dawson, the tennis coach, the man who had been spending an inordinate amount of time with his wife under the guise of improving her serve, the mysterious text messages that made Patricia smile secretively, her sudden dedication to fitness that had her spending hours at the tennis club. The pieces clicked together with the same precision Blake used in the operating room. Late-night tennis meetings, hushed phone calls, the way Patricia's eyes would light up at the mention of her training sessions. A lesser man might have burst into the room, confronting his wife in a rage. But Blake Kerr hadn't become one of the country's top cardiothoracic surgeons by acting on impulse. His mind, trained by years of high-stakes surgeries, was already analyzing, planning, preparing. Without making a sound, Blake retreated to his study. His movements were deliberate, controlled, the same way he handled a scalpel during a critical procedure. As he sat behind his desk, his expression remained neutral, but his eyes had taken on the focused intensity his surgical team knew well. Patricia's voice continued to float down the hallway, discussing the details of her betrayal with her mother, unaware that her carefully constructed plan had just begun to unravel. The following days saw Blake operating with the same precision he used in surgery, but this time, his careful cuts were designed to expose his wife's deception. Every movement was calculated, every reaction measured. During breakfast, Blake maintained his usual routine, scanning medical journals while sipping his coffee, seemingly oblivious to Patricia's poorly hidden smirks at her phone. His phone, however, was quietly recording every conversation, every subtle interaction. At the hospital, Blake threw himself into preparing for a groundbreaking heart surgery. The procedure, if successful, could revolutionize treatment options for dozens of patients. His colleagues noticed his increased focus, attributing it to the high stakes of the upcoming operation. Dr. Kerr, a young resident, approached him during rounds. "The board is particularly interested in the outcome of this procedure." Blake nodded, his mind simultaneously tracking multiple threads: the surgery preparation, the evidence gathering, the facade of normalcy. "Then we'll make sure to exceed their expectations." Meanwhile, Patricia grew bolder in her indiscretions. At the country club, she sat too close to Casey Dawson, their heads bent together over supposed training schedules. Blake observed from a distance as their mutual friends awkwardly averted their eyes, discomfort evident in their forced smiles. Jay Fuller, Blake's longtime friend and fellow doctor, approached him at the club bar. "Hey, Blake. Patricia mentioned she'd be late tonight. Something about an emergency tennis committee meeting." Blake noticed the slight tremor in Jay's voice, the way his eyes wouldn't quite meet Blake's. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Jay was complicit in covering Patricia's affair. "Thanks for letting me know," Blake replied smoothly, logging this betrayal away with the others. Later that day, Blake met with Lawrence Sullivan, the city's most formidable divorce attorney. The meeting took place in a private room at a downtown restaurant, far from prying eyes. "Document everything," Sullivan advised, his expression grim. Every meeting, every call, every suspicious transaction. Blake pulled out a tablet, displaying the evidence he'd already gathered. "I'm ahead of you there." Sullivan's eyebrows rose as he swiped through the files. "Most clients come to me with suspicions. You're bringing me a case." The discovery of Patricia's secret bank account came through meticulous investigation. Blake traced the money transfers with the same attention to detail he used in examining medical charts. Each transaction told a story of premeditated betrayal. Then came the email from Brooke Dawson. Casey's ex-wife had heard rumors about his latest student and felt compelled to reach out. "Dr. Kerr," her message began, "you should know that Casey has a pattern. He specifically targets wealthy married women. Your wife isn't his first, and she won't be his last." Brooke's information provided a critical piece of the puzzle. Casey Dawson wasn't just an opportunistic tennis coach. He was a calculated predator with a history of similar affairs. At the hospital, Blake channeled his personal turmoil into professional excellence. The revolutionary surgery he'd been preparing for became his anchor, a reminder of who he was beyond his failing marriage. The operation itself was a masterpiece of surgical precision. For 8 hours, Blake worked with unwavering focus, his hands steady as he pioneered a new technique that would change lives. "Remarkable work, Dr. Kerr." Dr. Troy Clements, the chief of surgery, congratulated him afterward. "This will put Memorial Hospital on the map." The celebration dinner that followed was an exercise in restraint. Patricia played her role perfectly, hanging on Blake's arm and beaming with pride. But her phone kept lighting up under the table, Casey's messages providing a constant counterpoint to her performance. Later that night, as Blake worked in his study, Patricia's voice once again carried through the house. She was on another call with her mother, unaware that every word was being recorded. "The allegations need to be believable," her mother counseled. "We'll start small, emotional manipulation first, then escalate." "What about the twins?" Patricia asked, referring to Taylor and Sandy. "They need to side with me for this to work." "They're in college now," her mother replied. "Promise them whatever they want. Once we get Blake's money, we can control the narrative." Blake sat in his darkened study, listening to his wife and mother-in-law plot his destruction. His expression remained impassive, but his eyes held the same intensity they did during complex surgeries. Every word they spoke was another piece of evidence, another tool he would use to excise this cancer from his life. As he sat there, Blake Kerr wasn't just a surgeon planning a precision strike. He was a man preparing to cut out the malignancy that threatened to destroy everything he'd built. And like every surgery he'd performed, failure wasn't an option. Blake Kerr sat in his office at Memorial Hospital, his fingers dancing across the keyboard with surgical precision. The screen displayed his banking interface as he methodically transferred assets to secure accounts he'd established days earlier. Each transaction was documented, photographed, and logged with the same attention to detail he brought to his medical charts. A notification popped up, another successful transfer. The joint accounts were being drained, though Blake carefully left enough to avoid any legal complications. His mouse hovered over the college tuition payment portal before clicking cancel on the upcoming installments. His phone buzzed, a text from Taylor and Sandy confirming their lunch meeting. Blake had chosen an upscale restaurant across town, far from their usual haunts where Patricia's social circle might spot them. The twins arrived together, their father's punctuality evident in their timing. Taylor, with her father's analytical mind, and Sandy, possessing his quiet strength, settled into their seats. Concern creased their brows at their father's unusual secrecy. "Dad, what's going on?" Taylor asked, her pre-med training making her particularly attuned to subtle changes. "You've never asked us to meet like this before." Blake pulled out his tablet, his expression grave. "There's something you need to hear," he said, pressing play on the first recording. Patricia's voice filled their private dining room, discussing her plans to falsely accuse their father of domestic crime. The twins' faces transformed as they listened, shock, disgust, and anger playing across their features in waves. "That's not even all of it," Blake said quietly, playing the second recording. the conversation about manipulating the twins themselves. Sandy's hands clenched into fists. She was going to use us? Against you? Taylor's expression hardened, a mirror of her father's surgical focus. The tennis lessons, the late meetings, it was all with Casey? Blake nodded, letting his children process the betrayal at their own pace. He'd seen enough patients receive life-altering news to know when silence was the best medicine. What are you going to do? Taylor finally asked. I'm handling it, Blake replied, his voice steady. But I needed you to know the truth before things start happening. Your tuition payments have been suspended. Good, Sandy interrupted. We don't want her money. Or her manipulation, Taylor added, her voice cold. Blake studied his children, seeing in them the same strength he'd relied on throughout his career. This won't be easy. Your mother will try to turn this against me, against us. The twins exchanged glances before Taylor spoke for both of them. We're with you, Dad. All the way. Meanwhile, across town, Patricia stared at her banking app in growing panic. The accounts were nearly empty, the regular transfers she'd come to rely on had stopped, and her credit cards were declined. Her manicured fingers trembled as she called Casey. Something's wrong, she hissed into the phone. All the money, it's gone. Casey's voice oozed false confidence. Don't worry, babe. We'll figure something out. Blake probably just made a mistake with the accounts. But Patricia heard the undertone in his voice, the slight waver that suggested his interest lay more with the missing money than with her welfare. As she ended the call, Patricia noticed an email notification. Payment declined. University tuition? Her carefully constructed plan was starting to unravel, and for the first time, real fear crept into her heart. The confrontation erupted in Blake's home office that evening. Patricia burst through the door, her face flushed with anger and panic. What have you done? She demanded, waving her phone displaying the empty account balances. How dare you? How dare I? Blake's voice cut through her tirade, cool and precise as a scalpel. That's an interesting choice of words, Patricia. Don't play games with me, she snarled. I'll ruin you. One phone call to the police about domestic crime. Blake pressed a button on his computer, and Patricia's voice filled the room. Then I'll accuse him of domestic crime and live with Casey and the kids from his money. Patricia's face drained of color. Blake continued playing segments of recordings, her conversations with her mother, her plans to manipulate their children, everything. You've been recording me, she whispered, her bravado crumbling. Let's be precise, Blake said, his tone clinical. I've been gathering evidence. Something any reasonable person would do when they discover a conspiracy against them. Across town, Casey Dawson was already distancing himself from the imploding situation. He'd seen the writing on the wall the moment Patricia mentioned the frozen accounts. In the tennis club's private courts, he focused his attention on Mandy, a young student with a trust fund and naive eyes. Your form is really improving, he said smoothly, standing closer than necessary to adjust her stance. The same moves he'd used on Patricia, recycled for a new target. Patricia's frantic calls went straight to voicemail. Her text messages received increasingly shorter responses until they stopped altogether. The reality of her situation began to sink in as she watched her lover's attention shift to younger, wealthier prey. Jay Fuller, believing himself clever, attempted to warn Patricia about Blake's evidence collection. He cornered her after a country club luncheon. Patricia, you need to be careful. Blake knows everything, he whispered. He's been gathering proof. Dr. Fuller, a stern voice interrupted. Two men in suits approached, badges glinting. We're from the insurance fraud division. We need to discuss some irregularities in your billing practices. Jay's face went pale as he realized Blake had outmaneuvered him too. His years of insurance fraud, carefully hidden, had been exposed with surgical precision. Patricia and her mother launched their desperate counterattack, spreading whispers through the hospital corridors about Blake's supposed instability and aggression. But they miscalculated badly. Dr. Kerr's revolutionary surgery saved my daughter's life, one board member declared during an emergency meeting. These accusations are absurd. Dr. Troy Clements, standing at the head of the conference table, addressed the board. Dr. Kerr's work has put Memorial Hospital at the forefront of cardiac care. His reputation is impeccable. The rumors died quickly, suffocated by Blake's sterling reputation and recent surgical triumph. Patricia's attempts to poison his professional life only served to further isolate her. Taylor and Sandy packed their belongings from the family home efficiently, their movements precise and determined. They'd inherited their father's ability to compartmentalize emotion when necessary. "She actually thought we'd believe her over Dad," Sandy muttered, boxing up photos from happier times. Taylor nodded, her expression grim. "She never really knew us at all." Blake's new apartment was smaller but warmly furnished, a fresh start free from Patricia's influence. The twins settled in easily, their presence transforming the space into a real home. Casey made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. He approached Blake in the hospital parking lot, a manila envelope in his hands. "I have evidence that could embarrass you," he said, trying to sound threatening. "Photos, email." Blake didn't let him finish. Without a word, he handed Casey his own envelope. Inside were detailed reports of Casey's previous scams, statements from other wealthy women he'd targeted, and financial records showing his pattern of fraud. "Would you like to compare evidence?" Blake asked quietly, his surgeon's eyes dissecting Casey's bravado. "Or would you prefer to walk away while you still can?" Casey's swagger deflated as he realized he'd brought a knife to a gunfight. Blake had outmaneuvered him at every turn, his precision and thoroughness leaving no room for counterplay. As Casey slunk away, his schemes in tatters, Patricia watched from her car across the street. Her carefully constructed world had crumbled to dust. Her lover had abandoned her, her children despised her, and her husband had proved to be far more formidable than she'd ever imagined. The man she dismissed as a workaholic surgeon, too absorbed in his career to notice her deception, had systematically dismantled her life with the same precision he used in the operating room. And like his surgeries, his operation had been a complete success. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Lawrence Sullivan rose to present Blake Kerr's case. The veteran divorce attorney moved with the confidence of a man holding a winning hand. "Your Honor," Sullivan began, "what we have here is not merely a case of infidelity, but a calculated conspiracy to defraud and defame my client." Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her discount store outfit a stark contrast to her former designer wardrobe. Her attorney, a public defender since no private lawyer would take her case, shuffled papers nervously. Sullivan methodically presented the evidence: recordings, financial records, photographs. Each piece clicked into place like a surgical instrument being laid out for an operation. "And now, Your Honor, we present evidence of premeditated plans to falsely accuse Dr. Kerr of domestic crime." Sullivan played the recordings that had first alerted Blake to his wife's betrayal. Patricia's face contorted with rage and fear as her own voice filled the courtroom. "Then I'll accuse him of domestic crime and live with Casey and the kids from his money." The judge's expression darkened with each new piece of evidence. When Patricia's mother took the stand to testify against Blake, Sullivan was ready. "Mrs. Henderson," Sullivan addressed Patricia's mother, "could you explain these emails?" He projected a series of messages onto the courtroom screen, showing years of the older woman facilitating her daughter's affairs. "That's private correspondence." Patricia's mother sputtered. "Indeed," Sullivan replied coldly. "Private correspondence showing a pattern of enabling adultery and fraud, not just with Mr. Dawson, but with 3 other men over the past decade." The courtroom stirred as this revelation landed. Patricia's mother deflated on the stand, her credibility evaporating. Next came the twins' testimony. Taylor took the stand first, her composure matching her father's surgical precision. "My mother saw us as assets," Taylor stated, her voice clear and firm. "She planned to use us as weapons against our father. But Dad never once spoke ill of her to us. He let the truth speak for itself." Sandy followed, his testimony equally damaging. "While Mom was plotting with her tennis coach, Dad was saving lives and supporting our dreams. The choice of who to believe wasn't hard." Throughout their testimony, Blake sat stoically, his expression neutral but his eyes reflecting pride in his children's strength. The judge's disgust became increasingly evident as the case unfolded. When news arrived that Casey Dawson had fled town, served with multiple lawsuits from previous victims emboldened by Blake's stand, it was the final nail in Patricia's coffin. "These other women," Sullivan explained, all wealthy, all targeted by Mr. Dawson, all with similar stories. Mrs. Kerr wasn't his first victim, but thanks to Dr. Kerr's actions, she will be his last. Patricia slumped in her chair as her carefully constructed world collapsed completely. The lover who had promised to stand by her was gone, her mother had been discredited, and her own children had testified against her. The judge's ruling was decisive and devastating. 3 months after the divorce ruling, Patricia stood outside Blake's apartment building, her expensive makeup unable to hide the toll of recent events. She pressed the buzzer repeatedly, her desperation evident. Blake answered the door, his expression impassive. The contrast between them was stark. While Patricia showed the strain of her downfall, Blake looked stronger than ever. "Blake, please," Patricia began, tears streaming down her face. "I've lost everything. I made a terrible mistake. We could try again, start over." Without a word, Blake pressed play on his phone. Patricia's voice filled the hallway. "Once he's done paying for the kid's college, I'm filing for divorce. Then I'll accuse him of domestic crime." Patricia's pleas died in her throat as Blake quietly shut the door, the soft click more final than any slam could have been. Inside the apartment, Taylor and Sandy were setting up for a holiday dinner, their first of many new traditions. The twins had flourished in their college environments, their father's unwavering support allowing them to focus on their studies despite the family turmoil. "She tried again?" Taylor asked, though she already knew the answer. Blake nodded once, then turned to help with dinner preparations. There was no need to dwell on Patricia's desperate attempts at reconciliation. At Memorial Hospital, Blake's reputation had only grown stronger. His pioneering work in cardiac surgery attracted international attention, and his handling of personal adversity earned him deep respect from colleagues. Among these colleagues, Dr. Claudia Reynolds, a brilliant anesthesiologist, had worked alongside Blake during several groundbreaking procedures. Their professional rapport gradually evolved into something more, built on mutual respect and shared values. 1 year later, Blake's new home filled with warmth and laughter as Taylor and Sandy returned for summer break. The elegant but comfortable house reflected its owner, sophisticated without pretense, welcoming but dignified. "Did you hear about Mom?" Sandy asked, showing his father a social media post. Patricia's new life as a receptionist at a small clinic was a far cry from her previous social status. "And Casey's been arrested in Arizona," Taylor added. "Tried his scam on the wrong woman," a state prosecutor. Blake absorbed the news with quiet satisfaction, but his attention was drawn to the doorbell. Claudia arrived, bringing dessert for their family dinner. Her presence felt natural, unforced, the antithesis of Patricia's calculated performances. Taylor and Sandy exchanged knowing looks as they watched their father with Claudia. This was what a real relationship looked like, built on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine care. As they settled around the dinner table, Blake's phone rang. Dr. Troy Clement's name flashed on the screen. "Congratulations, Chief of Surgery," Clements announced without preamble. The board's decision was unanimous. Blake shared the news with his loved ones, their genuine celebration a stark contrast to the artificial praise of his previous life. Looking around the table, he saw his real family, children who chose truth over manipulation, a potential partner who valued integrity over appearances, and a future built on his own terms. The game-changing surgery that had coincided with Patricia's betrayal had become a footnote in his success story. By refusing to be a victim, by methodically excising the cancer of betrayal from his life, Blake had shown his children what real strength looked like. As laughter filled his new home, Blake Kerr knew that every calculated decision, every carefully planned step away from betrayal, had led him to something better than mere survival. He had turned crisis into opportunity, betrayal into triumph. The man who had saved countless lives in the operating room had also saved himself, and in doing so, had built a life more genuine and fulfilling than the one Patricia had tried to destroy. Epilogue. 5 years later. Time had a way of revealing the true consequences of betrayal. For Patricia Henderson, formerly Patricia Kerr, the fall from grace continued long after the divorce. The small clinic where she worked as a receptionist had closed, forcing her to take an even lower position at a veterinary office. Her once manicured hands, now rough from cleaning kennels, served as a daily reminder of her downfall. The modest studio apartment she called home was a far cry from the luxurious house she had shared with Blake. Her mother, disgraced by the revelation of her role in multiple affairs, had retreated to a small town in Florida, their relationship strained by mutual blame. The society circles that had once been Patricia's entire world now treated her as a cautionary tale. Her name was whispered at country club gatherings, not in gossip, but in warnings to young wives about the price of betrayal. Casey Dawson's fate had been even more severe. After his arrest in Arizona, investigations revealed a pattern of fraud spanning multiple states. He now resided in a federal prison, serving an 8-year sentence for wire fraud and extortion. His victims, emboldened by Blake's example, had come forward one by one, each testimony adding years to his sentence. His charming smile and tennis prowess meant little in the prison yard. Jay Fuller, following his conviction for insurance fraud, had lost his medical license. Last anyone heard, he was selling pharmaceutical supplies in a neighboring state, his professional reputation permanently tarnished. His wife had divorced him, taking their children and leaving him to face his disgrace alone. In stark contrast, Blake Kerr's life had flourished. Under his leadership as chief of surgery, Memorial Hospital had become a leading center for cardiac innovation. His pioneering techniques had saved countless lives, and medical students competed fiercely for residency positions under his mentorship. His marriage to Claudia 2 years after the divorce had brought a new dimension of joy to his life. Their partnership, built on mutual respect and shared values, showed Taylor and Sandy what genuine love looked like. Claudia's steady presence and brilliant mind complemented Blake's strength perfectly, their combined medical expertise making them a formidable team in the operating room and in life. Taylor had followed in her father's footsteps, excelling in medical school and showing promise in cardiothoracic surgery. Her analytical mind and steady hands suggested she would carry on the Kerr legacy of medical excellence. Sandy had chosen a different path, becoming a successful criminal defense attorney, his father's experience having shown him the importance of justice and truth. The twins maintained no contact with their mother. They had received multiple letters from Patricia over the years, each more desperate than the last, but these remained unopened in a drawer. They had chosen to focus on the authentic relationships in their lives, rather than the manipulation of their past. Blake and Claudia's home had become the center of family gatherings, filled with the warmth of genuine affection. Holiday dinners, once tense affairs under Patricia's superficial perfectionism, were now celebrations of real connection. The addition of Claudia's young daughter from her previous marriage had brought new light to Blake's role as a father, showing him that family bonds transcended biological ties. Dr. Troy Clements, now semi-retired, often remarked that the hospital's remarkable transformation under Blake's leadership had its roots in that pivotal moment of personal crisis. Some men are broken by betrayal, he would say. Others use it as forge to remake themselves stronger. Brooke Dawson, Casey's ex-wife who had first warned Blake, had found her own peace. Her decision to reach out had not only helped Blake, but had given other victims the courage to come forward. She occasionally consulted with advocacy groups helping women identify and avoid predatory relationships. The country club that had once been the stage for Patricia's indiscretions had changed as well. The old guard of enablers and secret keepers had largely been replaced by a younger crowd who valued authenticity over appearances. Blake maintained his membership, though he rarely visited. His focus was on substance rather than social status. One day, as Blake left the hospital after a successful surgery, he passed a woman in shabby medical scrubs leaving a hiring agency. It took him a moment to recognize Patricia, her appearance so far removed from the polished socialite she had once been. Their eyes met briefly, hers filled with desperate recognition, his with complete indifference. He continued to his car without breaking stride, his mind already on the family dinner awaiting him at home. That evening, surrounded by the love of his true family, Claudia, the twins, their partners, and his stepdaughter, Blake realized that Patricia's betrayal had ultimately been a gift. It had stripped away the artificial facade of his previous life, allowing him to build something real and lasting in its place. The man who had once discovered his wife's betrayal through an overheard phone call was gone. In his place stood someone stronger, wiser, and more complete. A man who had turned trauma into triumph, betrayal into blessing, and loss into legacy. Blake Kerr had not just survived. He had redefined what it meant to win.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.